Okay, this is morning revelations, but more than a morning revelation, it is a lifetime truth. Um, Sometimes, a lot of times, God will take our tragedies and He will interrupt it with a triumph. He will take our traumas and He will interrupt it with salvation. He will take those things that are meant to break us and have us fall apart and fall away from Him. Situations that after we give our testimony, people say, I don't know how you survived that. I don't know. I wouldn't know that about you. I can't believe that. And He creates those but God moments. But the thing is not only does it happen all the time through the Bible, it happens all the time to individuals now. Throughout time, this is how He has worked His purpose in the earth through those who are obedient. And though we like to preach that part of it a lot because we want people to fall into obedience, it is a better life. It truly is. But the thing is, God works mysteriously, right? We say that all the time. He works through our ignorance. He works through our stupidity. He works through our challenges. He works through our disobedience. We don't always preach about that part. We will say that in Romans 8:28, it tells us that he will turn everything for the good of those who love Him, which really is about obedience, though. It's for those who follow His commandments, for those who seek Him, for those who pursue Him. That's what love means there. And therefore, for those who are obedient to Him, He will work everything out for your good. But He does it a lot of times through our disobedience. We hide that part from each other. We don't always share the disobedience unless it's a cute little anecdote to give a little punch with our sermons, with our Bible studies, with our devotionals, to give a little, oh man, one day I knew I should have prayed that morning and I didn't, and this happened and that happened, and then there was a God moment. We'll tell those little stories. But He does bigger than that. That's like capping the moment, the 40 years in the desert. That's like capping it as a stub toe and a curse word. But then God turned it around. That was 40 years of disobedience. But that was 40 years of disobedience where God was moving the whole entire time. There was not one day He was not providing miracles and provision and purpose for that group of individuals. There was not, it was a whole nation actually, I guess, even more powerful. There was not a millisecond that His mind was not on them. And we preach it like He was frustrated and angry with them, and therefore you're going to stay in the desert. When really it was His mercy and His grace and His love that gave them this opportunity to flourish and grow in a sanctified and solemn place. The desert is not just about famine and drought and, harshness. He gave them lush moments, communion with Him, intimacy with the Father, and He created a safe space for them. These are individuals who left tragedy after tragedy, slavery in the worst way. When we have all these Black history films and museums and stuff like that, that is super important, but it shows the savagery of slavery. This is what the children of Israel had just left. Slavery is not pretty for any member of society. It's still slavery. It's still naked children beaten. It's still grandmothers dragging their broken, sore bodies. It's still, one group of people oppressing another group with sexual immorality, with rapes and beatings and brutality, and separating men and women and showing each other, the horrible parts of each other to purposely put a dissension into the family. It's evil riding over a group of individuals. Slavery is still slavery, no matter which society is heralding it. So the children of Israel had just left slavery, and he brought them to a place of safety. That even though they were still languishing back and forth between their sin and their guilt and their shame and their tortured trauma mindsets, he was still providing a safe space for them to be crazy until the whole nation could come to themselves and he could pull them into the promised land. He was still allowing trauma to do what trauma needed to do to work its way out as he held on to and then interrupted their course with triumph. He does that a lot for us. And sometimes we don't recognize it because it's something that we don't usually share outside of our own inner struggle. When I was small, I don't even have a memory of it. I can vividly remember at 4 years old feeling abandoned and feeling like I had to take care of myself and that I wasn't being protected. I can remember that feeling. I don't know specifically what occurred before that feeling, but I can assume what did. Because at 4, I do remember sitting in my brother's truck, and my dad had a stash of Playboy magazines in a brown bag. And I would sit out there and look through the magazines and look at the women and look at the articles. Not that I was really reading them, but look at the words and look at the pictures and look at the situations and stuff. And I did that from 4 to maybe 5. We moved maybe when I was about 6 from that house in the country. And, but I can remember sitting out there looking at their bodies, looking at all that sexual stuff that a 4-year-old should not be exposed to. But it was not new to me. I remember in that same household having nightmares and moments that seemed more like a reality of someone coming into my room and there being trauma and violation. I remember having so much fear about the situation that I would be panicked and frozen sometimes. And the train is going by. And I remember running to my sister's room and hiding on the other side of her in the bed, thinking that, and this is so messed up, but I was a little kid, but thinking that if this what I knew would come into my room to attack me would either not find me in my room and therefore I'd be safe, or would my sister would protect me or would get her first. And somehow that would still save me. But I remember all that kind of stuff. And like I said, at 4 and 5, I don't remember the exact things going on, but I remember something happened that was not okay. It was not a movie I watched. It was not a book I saw. It was not a story I heard. It was an experience. And after that, from 4 to now, it has been the same repeated horror story with different characters over and over and over and over and over again. That's 40 years of unwanted touches, of family members, friends of family, guys at school, um, strangers, people I barely knew. Wanted, eventually at some point, just numbing and allowing things. But I remembered so many unwanted touches and grabbing and stalking and just trauma. Just a lot of trauma on top of trauma. I remember a conversation when I was about 15 with my dad over infidelity. And he made a statement in his own pain that stuck with me and curved steps after that and choices. And he said that men have needs. And he spoke about, just if the fact that it was like a animalistic fact of life, that if men didn't get their physical needs, their sexual needs met, that, they have to, that it doesn't matter about vows, it doesn't matter about marriage. This was the specific conversation we had, and that didn't matter because men had needs. And this was coming at a time where he still had a stash of pornographic movies, VCR tapes, and everything else in his desk. I remember cleaning up around them. And so at the time when he spoke that, it hit me so harshly because I was in a purity culture, right? I was in the 90s when we went to youth group meetings. I was saved at 13, went to Falls Creek every year. And we even had people come to our school that would talk about purity and how important it was to be celibate before marriage and save yourself before marriage, and that, God would honor that, and there was a vow there, and that there was a covenant when you got married, that where you enter in sex with your then. Now, nobody ever explained during that time period. I had the ring, I had bracelets, all that kind of stuff, and I believed in that. But in none of the youth groups did they explain how that factors into a sexually traumatized life. Nobody ever broke it down how that was supposed to work for you if your body had already been ravaged without your permission. And therefore, does that make your purity gone? Does it make it a miss? Does it make it dissipate? Does it make it like ghost? Do you still fight for it? Do you still carry on in that manner? Like, what are you supposed to do with that? Like, nobody ever discussed that. They did not explain about God's restoration, about God's redemption, about God's provision for tragedy. No one spoke about that. Nobody talked about Tamar in the Bible, who's raped by her brother and then thrown out. After he raped, he has this lust that he thinks is love, and he takes her. She pleads with him, just ask my dad, which was David. Ask our dad, and he will give me to you. Just don't do this. And he rapes her, and then hatred forms up, because, when we have sin, after we have lusted after something, that sin creates hate for the same thing that we lusted for. It creates this evil relationship now between what you thought you had to have, what you thought was an animal instinct and a have to, what you thought was something that you could not live without, and that was somehow excused for you doing whatever you have to get it. That thing now becomes also the thing that you cannot stand, that you despise, that is boiling up inside of you, that makes you just disgusted. So, in the middle of his hate, he throws her out of his house and bolts the door locked, closed. And she is stuck in the streets with her shame and her guilt and her pain and her trauma. Nobody talked about that in church. Nobody talked about what was she supposed to do. She was a virgin. She had clothes that represented her being a virgin. She had pride. She had a title. Everyone knew she was one of David's virgin daughters, just by appearance. So now when that's ripped away from you, what do you do with that? So no one talked about that. But there is provision for that. Our God is a good God. He knows about these things. The tragedies that we face in 2022 are nothing new to him. He knows exactly how this stuff plays out. But he again creates an atmosphere of protection and safety. And it sounds weird when you've been traumatized and you've been, beaten, abused, and molested, and tossed around and treated like a thing and not a person. It is a weird thing to hear that God protects. You're thinking he didn't protect me. Or that God creates safety. You're thinking that was not safe, what I went through. That was the opposite of safe. I can recall, and I still have to fight the thoughts of every time that I have been violated or mistreated because of my physical appearance, because of something in someone else that thought they had to have what they saw over here. My very first kiss came from the lips of a rapist. I was raped when I was 16, and earlier in the evening, the guy forced a kiss on me, and that was my first kiss. I don't have that memory that people have to be like, oh, my first kiss was under the tree with Jimmy from Second Hour, or something, And the first time I was told I was pretty was my best friend's boyfriend, who asked me if I wanted to go ride around. And then he pulled over in a side road and jumped on top of me and asked if he could just do some things so he could relieve himself, basically. And he told me how I was pretty, and he always thought I was pretty. That was the first time I ever heard someone say that to me. But it came along with that tragedy. It came along with that experience. There is this stuff that happens in our lives. Nobody is outside of that. Nobody is protected from the sin in this world. So when I say God protects and he offers safety, you got to take your mind out of the context of what we've created as the definition for protection and safety. Okay? Because like I said, those children of Israel, they were coming out of depravity. They had homes, they had things, they had families. But don't make that think their slavery was any less than slavery. Okay? They was coming out of tragedy, depraved culture that had been bearing down on them in an oppressive way for a very long time. We look so harshly and judge so harshly those 40 years in the desert. And why didn't they just do this? And why didn't they just trust God? And why did they have so much unbelief? And why did they have so much doubt? Why did they turn their backs on him so easily and so quickly? And what was wrong with them people? When you've been in enough trauma, there is something that happens to your brain that you can literally be walking out the steps of life and not engaged in one thing you're doing. One of the last traumatic events that happened to me sexually wise was about 2 years ago. And when it happened, I played it off. I laughed it off. I acted like it wasn't a big deal. But then the darkness came that just clouded and fogged over my mind, basically. I don't know if I turned my notifications off this time. Sorry. So I'm going to pause every time something pops up. And I hope something's not shooting through. Oh gosh, I hate it when I do that. I think I really, yeah, I think I forgot to turn it off. Sorry. But there's a thing that happens. I call it autopilot. Okay. One of my ex-husbands told me about it years ago when I was young. He said sometimes when we were engaged in knowing each other biblically, that I would get this blank look and my body would get rigid and I would just kind of like not be there. And I learned that PTSD is what we call it now. But I also learned that, that was traumatic responses from the things I've experienced. So what I started realizing though, too, is that I could totally function, talk to you, joke, laugh, cook dinner, hang out with my kids. I can walk around. I could do, I don't know who's texting me or what their emergency is, but anyway, I can do all these things and the whole time I can be on autopilot. Everything in here is just totally shut off. Like my soul will be totally shut off and everything else, just like a plane. That's why I call it autopilot. Just like a plane can still fly, can still stay afloat, can still do what it needs to do with those passengers and everything else without the actual pilot doing anything. That's how I can react. And I'm sure there's plenty of other people that can relate. So about 2 years ago, I was assaulted. And, well, maybe it's even, I don't know. It's going on 2 years. Anyways, I was assaulted and I just played it off like it wasn't really a big deal. Like, I'm tough. I'm strong. It's not a big deal. I'm cool. Called the police, told them about it and everything because I didn't want the guy like doing the same thing to other people. But I'm like, I'm good. I'll keep it pushing. I've been through a lot. I'm a survivor of domestic violence. I've had my head bashed in with folding chairs. I've had rifles at my womb. I was like, I'm good. Solid. So, but what happened was within the month after, I just shut down. And then I just engaged in some behavior that was like ridiculous. Even my closest friends at the time was like, what is wrong with you? Like, we've seen you do some crazy stuff, but that was, ooh. And I was just like, I don't know, and I was pulling out the animalistic instinct things. Like, I guess I was just in lust. I guess I was just having some issues with this. I guess I was just, I don't know what I was going through, whatever, But it was trauma. And I was in a dark path. Like a dark, dark path. And God interrupted it. He sat there while I sat there in my ignorance and my disobedience, just wallowing like the prodigal son, just wallowing. And He sat there with me while I wallowed. And then like he brought in things just a little bit at a time, just pieces at a time, that just started to interrupt the put a little break, a little crack of dawn. No pun intended, totally intended. A little crack of dawn into the darkness. And like, it's all through the Bible. If you read, Abigail and Nabal, people love to pull them out. Okay, so Abigail was married to Nabal. Nabal was kind of like a piece of work. And he was disrespectful to David, who needed some stuff while he was running from Saul and everything. And he had about 400 dudes with him. And Nabal was like, I don't know you. You ain't getting them from me. And so then David was in his fleshly response was like, oh, shoot, we about to just slice this dude down and get our stuff and keep it pushing. Well, his wife, Abigail, who was real pretty. I love how the Bible has to tell you who's pretty. That lets you know, I'm going to just do a little interruption there. That lets you know that our physical appearance is also a part of our calling. People want to play that one down too. People don't preach that. They don't preach to you about the fact that God has created everything about you for what he intended a great purpose to be. So when they talk about women being this, that, and the other in the church, and all this, it was for that context, because they needed to understand modesty. They needed to understand their role in submission and authority. They needed to understand how to just shut up and listen so God could speak. But when he has made people with fair countenance, he has made people fair to look upon. He is all the other things that they say in the Bible. When he makes you pretty, he made you pretty for a reason. Don't downplay, sis. Don't dare let nobody downplay your looks or make it seem like you are too much of a good physical thing to still seek God. Because I bought into a lot of those lies for a long time, that either if I was going to be humble and in a relationship with my Lord, then I had to look like something rolled under the bus. I had to, wear baggy clothes, or if I wore clothes, wear, stuff that just covered me, and then, not wear makeup, not wear earrings, not wear fun stuff, just barely have my hair done, just fall to the background, girl, fall to the background with all that. And then I went to the other extreme, like, okay, well, I'm going to, live my best pretty life. And then it was all over sexualized and, for the world and everything like that. I say from OnlyFans to only God. That is the life God has given me, from OnlyFans to only God. So, yeah. Then God said, I'd made, he started pulling these scriptures out at me that remark about how women looked, that would say, like, right before the scripture tells you what powerful things they did or said, or even the subtle things that they did that ended up being great, it'll tell you how they were pretty. It'll tell you how they were pleasing to look upon. It will tell you. And I'm like, that ain't by accident. God starts ministering to me with that. That ain't by accident. Even your curves and beauty that Satan used for so many years to try to make you feel like you were dysfunctional, I have a purpose for how I created you. I have a masterful purpose for the shell that I gave you, for this spirit and this soul. And I was like, yeah, you're pretty good. You're pretty good at this. So anyway, Abigail went and met David. It's in 1 Samuel. Met David and did what she did because she was wise. She was a wise chick. She knew how to talk. She knew how to assess the situation. She saved the household. Okay, she saved her husband, which God then, the tragedy of whatever funk she was living in right there with that type of gentleman who also seemed to be drunk a lot. But anyway, he ended up dying. His heart got hardened. He got mad, upset about what she did. It doesn't say upset. It says his heart died and he turned into stone. But then it says 10 days later, he actually died, which lets me know that what happened to him immediately when she said what she did was an emotional, spiritual, physical, not physical death. It was an emotional, spiritual death first, and upset. I'm sure he went a little crazy, right? We know those type of dudes. Okay, so, and then 10 days later he died. Then David came and took her as his wife. Okay, now David had, at least in the scripture, at least 8 wives, at least. And Bathsheba was like the last one. Bathsheba, we all know that story where David saw her. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do, but he saw her, decided he wanted her. He took her. He had her. And then he handled things really bad. Bathsheba experienced tragedy. Now, Abigail experienced tragedy. She had all that stuff going on with her husband. She had all that stuff going on after he died. She had all that stuff going on. And then sorry about showing my feet, y'all. And then she became a queen. Restoration, right? God doing what he does, right? Okay. Then Bathsheba, David took her. Now, when we say took, that don't mean on a date. Okay. And then she became pregnant because guess what, people? When you sow a thing, there's a harvest. Imagine that. I know David couldn't be surprised. If you sow a seed, the seed you sowed, the specific seed you sowed, it's going to come back in a harvest. So he sowed a seed. It came back. She was pregnant. Duh. Okay, so anyway, so he plots against the husband, ends up killing the husband, or he sends the husband to the front line of the war that he was supposed to be at to begin with, and wasn't the reason he saw Bathsheba, and he ends up dying in battle. But basically, he killed him. That's how God refers to it later when Nathan the prophet comes and talks to him. You killed him. Okay, so then he's cursed with, they're going to be death and destruction on your house the rest of the days, which there was. This is how Tamar gets raped. But anyway, that's for another discussion, another morning revelation. Anyway, so Bathsheba, that's who I want to talk about, not David. Bathsheba was taken, raped, impregnated illegitimately. Her husband killed. And it said she mourned. So she cared for her husband. It wasn't like she didn't care for that man. But she didn't have no children before. And here she has a kid. And she's brought to the palace to be, a queen. One of the last queens, I imagine. So she probably didn't get no respect. Everybody, I'm sure, in the palace already knew about her situation and knew about her. So I'm sure that made interesting dinners and whatnot. But so anyway, then because of the sin that David committed, not Bathsheba, because of the sin that David committed, her firstborn child is also killed. He dies from an illness, from a sickness, because of the sin. Because that's what happens, people. God ain't out here just smiting folks because he can't stand us. And we get on his nerves because you cussed in church or that you wrote off the wrong thing on your taxes and stuff. But when you have sin that is not repented and not handled with him, and when you turn away from him and he's provided this sanctity for you to work your tragedy and traumas out, he knows you're going to experience them, and he provides this desert out of love and mercy and grace so you can work that stuff out, and you just walk around with pride and ego like, and what? Because David was prideful. He was, in this moment, go back, read it yourself, 2 Samuel. He was 12. He was on something. He was really smelling himself right then. He was doing a lot of, you do this and you do that and you come here and blah blah blah. And then when he plotted and did all this other stuff, he was smelling himself. Okay, so his sin caused their firstborn to die of disease, sickness. So here Again, Bathsheba went from being kidnapped, raped, illegally, illegitimately impregnated, to her husband being killed and her son dying of an illness. Permissible. That came through God's foresight, through his loving mercy. But her son dying. All within a year or so time. That's a lot. That's a lot of tragedy. That's a lot of trauma. She had to go through a lot. And in her tragedy and in her trauma, God did not forget about her, though. Her second born, Solomon. We should all know about Solomon. Solomon was a wise king. He had his issues, but he's known forever, even in non-churchy atmospheres, as being a wise king. And he was, although the youngest, although the last wife, the seed of the last wife, when David's end of David's life came, it was Solomon that became king. Bathsheba was one of the last people to speak a word to King David that had carried some weight. Bathsheba. The one, because of her beautiful appearance, was probably looked upon as just a thing with no virtue and no value, but what she could physically do for a person, for a man. But it was her seed that became king. It was her words that carried weight to move a king. It was the promise of restoration and redemption that God has for each and every one of us that saw through to pull her out of such trauma and tragedy to such triumph and purpose. He interrupts it. He does. If we sit in his sanctity of provision, in his desert. We all suffer through things in our own timing. And I imagine that for at least the first year or two that Bathsheba was walking around the halls of the palace, she was on autopilot. It might have been the first 15, 16 years. Until Solomon got on actual throne, it might have been that next 20, 25 years she was on autopilot because of what she had experienced, because of how she even got there. She was on autopilot. And that happens. And God just sits and waits. It sucks, but it happens. The children of Israel were on autopilot. That's why they didn't get it. That's why they couldn't get it. They couldn't move past. They was froze in their trauma. And God provided a place for them to work all that out. It was a bunch of stupid choices they were making. That does not condemn you. It's not the stupid choices. There was a bunch of sin. That does not condemn you. Jesus said he came not to condemn, but to offer life. It's not the sin that condemns you. It's not the bad choices. It's not the things that's been done to you. It's not the things you've chosen for yourself. It's not the things you've chosen for yourself. It's none of that that condemns you. What happened in the desert place when God gave them that season to work out that pain and that trauma and that miseducation from all of that is that they hardened their hearts. They turned like stone and away from God. just like Nabal sitting there with his hangover. The next morning, when Abigail told him, oh, by the way, I went ahead and gave all that stuff to David. They turned in stone. And the death that comes when you harden your heart to God is not always immediate, but it's happening. And that's what condemns us. Otherwise, he's got a purpose. He's got provisions. And although we think there's no safety and protection when all this trauma is happening, there always is. There's always his grace. Always. There is no exception. There's no exception. There's always grace. I met my husband in the midst of all that darkness that was brooding, and he was in his own darkness, and God, in this incredible way, saw fit to allow our paths to cross. And though we made some crazy, stupid choices at the beginning, he didn't condemn us for that. Because he's got grace and mercy to know that when your mind ain't right, your mind ain't right. When you're on autopilot, when you're still in the desert and you're still reeling from trauma and tragedy, you don't know what's up or down or left or right. When you're just struggling to find your next breath, he don't send in the flood for that. That's not the God that created the universe and put you together. He don't send in the flood for that. When Sodom and Gomorrah had to go, it wasn't because they was just sexually crazy. It wasn't because they was immoral and because they was just doing the most and they was just living their best lives and all this other nastiness. Okay, now they was doing all the nasty. That's why we even use those terms in legal ways for crimes. So they was doing all the nasty, but that's not what condemned them. It was they hardened their hearts and turned away from God. When societies fall into slavery, it's because they harden their hearts and turn away from God. Us as Black Americans, we want to preach all day long about what was done to us. But if you got love for the motherland, you got to open your mind and recognize us falling into slavery, just like every other society that's fallen into slavery, it was because of our hardened hearts turned to God. Turned away from God. It was our hardened hearts that turned away from God. That's why we fell into slavery. It wasn't for any other reason. And the things that we experienced during slavery is no different than the slavery that was done to all the other societies. We are not exempt. We are not the only ones. That is a lie from the devil. I'll be done in a minute. That is a lie from the devil, that he does it in great schemes and he does it in small schemes. When you're going through a tragedy and you're going through a trial and you're going through such pain, he wants you to feel like you're the only one that has this story. You're the only one that this has been done to. Because if you feel like that, you feel ostracized and you feel vacant and you feel like you want an island and you feel like, therefore, the one that created you cannot help you. Because you're the only one that this has happened to. And if God was really a good God, and you might not say these words to yourself, but subconsciously it's building a bitterness and a hardening of your heart to think this, that if you are the only one that's suffering this way, then he cannot have a great plan for you. He cannot have a redemption story. He cannot have a triumph in the middle of tragedy for you. So you better get out here and hustle hard and be a boss and get it done and get what you need to get and do what you need to do, because it's you against the world and you're going to have to take care of you, boo. That's what happens. So on a grand scheme, as a whole society, where we feel like the man has been holding us down and we feel like this is against us and that is against us and we better do this and we better do that and da 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 da. That's not what it is. And even in an individual level, that is not what it is. That is such deception and miseducation. That's not how that works. How it works is we have all suffered tragedy. We have all suffered these stories. Some of the things that I shared with you, oh my gosh, if 1,000 people watch this video, I promise you 1,000 people would be able to relate. Because if 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual trauma, that means at least those other 3 have known somebody that experienced sexual trauma or witnessed somebody that experienced sexual trauma or directly related to, was in the other room while their sister was getting something, was over there when this happened to their brother, was over here when Uncle so-and-so was doing such and such, and they just happened to skip out and not be a part of it, but they was affected. So if 1 in 4, and that's a low ball statistic, because you know how many people are not telling their stories, you know how many people are not calling police, you know how many people it don't go past family. Still, in 2022, it don't go past family. So that's a low ball statistic. But if you even go off of that, if 1 in 4 are affected by sexual trauma, then guess what? Them other 3 is affected too. So that's everybody, y'all. So my story is not unique. And there is strength in that. That's why the devil tries to isolate you when you're going through. Because there's strength in knowing that that sin did not just pick you out and that you were the only one because of something wrong with you. But it's understanding the power behind the fact that there is an enemy. So it's not that something was wrong with you, it's that something was right with you and that there was an enemy that plotted specifically against you. And these are the weapons of choice that he used against you. When you're in the military, and I'm going off a guess here because I ain't in the military and I ain't with nobody that is. But, okay, so we'll go off of gangs because I am with the gangster. So, if you're in a gang and you have to, handle business and do whatever and have these issues with this rival gang and whatnot, this, that, and the other, there are foot soldiers. Okay, there's stuff that you are just out there doing, and therefore there's damage, collateral damage that happens. And that is not specific for you necessarily, but it's more about the title on you. It's more about what you represent and not who you are and specific things about you. It's what you represent and what you can do. And that's why something comes against you, because the enemy, the other one, the ops, the police, whoever's against you, they know their weapons of choice, right? They got vice operations and everything. They know how to infiltrate, gangs and organized crime. They know the weapons of choice because they study who they're opposing. So when the ops is coming, and I'm only picking up the lingo from my gangster husband, I'm just saying. But when they're coming against you, like, they know what to use because they know what works and they know what has always worked and what will always work. We all watch movies about it all the time. We watch cop shows about it all the time. They use the same things, the same tactics, and they use that because they study the enemy and they know this is what works. So when you are attacked, when you got sexual stuff coming against you, when you're getting abused and, talked to in a crazy way, when you're getting oppressed and mistreated, when you're being pulled, if you're in another country or come from another country and you've actually seen actual slavery and actually experienced it, it's not because of something that is broken in you and wrong with you. Is because the enemy knows what arsenal to create to work against what you represent. and the title that is on you. Okay? That's how that works. I just wanted to share and tell you that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that there is hope, that God always, always, always provides triumph. He always provides a rainbow. He always provides a promise. He always provides provision. He's always ready with a way out of tragedy or sin. He's always ready with it for you. You just gotta seek. You just gotta know. You just gotta have confidence in a thing. Okay? All right. That was a long one, but it was one that he's placed on my heart and that needed to be done. All right. From OnlyFans to Only God, y'all. This is the mantra. This is what we're doing. It don't matter where you've been at, what you've done. That doesn't change where you can go, where God can take you. Promised land for us all. Have a good day.